greetings to all of you in the room. My name is Steve Collins. I'm coming to you from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And my understanding is I'm to begin with prayer and before we start the message. So if you're all with me there in the room, I will begin with asking our Creator's favor on the message today. Almighty Creator, our Father in heaven, the glory of all your people, of Israel and all the world, we come before you during this Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot period of time. We ask you that it would be a meaningful and a joyous festival there in Prescott, Arizona. We ask you for your favor and blessing on the hearing and the speaking of the message today, that it will build faith, that it will strengthen the conviction of people in you as the Creator and your Word as the real divine inspired Word for us. And we ask this all in the name of Yeshua, your Son. Amen. And, well, greetings and shalom to all of you. I'd like to express my thanks to Mike Bacon and all others who have sponsored this year's observance of the Feast of Tabernacles, a festival commanded to the ancient Israelite tribes in Leviticus 23, and it's also called Sukkot, and we're observing it today. As I think most there know, I'm the author of a series of 4 books examining the migrations and history of the 10 tribes of Israel. For those of you who were here last year, I gave a message about the ancient Israelite empire of Parthia, which is the 3rd book in my series on Israelite history. Today I'll be giving a message about my 2nd book in the series, which is called Israel's Lost Empires. After learning about history from the perspective of the 10 tribes of Israel, which is what you learn when you read my books, you can have faith in the Bible, not in spite of the historical record, but because of it. As you can see, there's complete union between the biblical narratives and what secular history has to say. And by the way, I'm completely comfortable with the usage of the divine names in either English or the Hebrew usages, and I will probably interchange them back and forth some in my message. My book, Israel's Lost Empires, covers a lot of historical ground. It begins by presenting evidence that the United Kingdom of ancient Israel under David and Solomon was a global world power, not some backward shepherd kingdom. It is vital to establish the original power and size of the kingdom of the Israelites before discussing its subsequent lost empires that were formed after the tribes were exiled. My book then examines the many different paths that the Israelite tribes took as they exited the Promised Land in their exile. The Bible promised they would be widely scattered among the nations, and that came to pass. My book then presents evidence about 2 specific Israelite empires which reigned for many centuries before they were overthrown. Both of these empires were founded long before the Parthian Empire, which I discussed last year, came into existence. One of the empires I'll mention today was dying out, just as Parthia rose to power, and the other continued alongside of Parthia and was a powerful ally of it. And this message will only have time to give the high points of the topics in my book. I'd like to start with 3 misconceptions, which should be the second slide appearing on the screen overhead, that most people have about the 10 tribes. The first misconception is the tribes all went into captivity when Israel fell about 721 BC. The second misconception is that the 10 tribes became lost nomads who could no longer be identified. The last one is that God or Yahweh permanently forsook them. All these assumptions are completely false, based on both biblical and secular evidence. Now, in Hosea 1, Yahweh said he would punish Israel, that means the 10 tribes, by expelling all of them from their promised land. This was God's pronouncement of judgment upon them for the accumulated sins they had. However, in verse 10 of Hosea 1, God also promised to so vastly increase the population of the 10 tribes after they were removed from the Promised Land, that their numbers would become like the sand of the sea. So they were to be vastly expanded in population after Yahweh sent them into exile. Hosea 1 is a very important chapter. It actually shows there are 2 covenants between God and the tribes of Israel. While God was driving them off the land for their sins, this affirmed the punishments of the covenant made between Yahweh and Israel via Moses. His promise to vastly increase their numbers after he exiled them affirmed a blessing of the covenant made between Yahweh and Abraham regarding Abraham's birthright descendants. The blessings and cursings of the covenant with Moses were conditional on the tribe's obedience to the divine commandments. But the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant were unconditional. That was based on Abraham's obedience and faith. Now, the Abrahamic covenant included many blessings, which I'll just run through very quickly on the screen here. In Genesis 13:15 to 16, it included again that huge number of descendants, which Hosea 1:10 referred to. Genesis 17, verses 4 and 6, refers to the fact that Abraham would be the father of many nations, not just one, and that he would also father dynasties of kings. In Genesis 22:17, his descendants are again promised to be as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sand of the sea, which again harkens right back to Hosea 1:10's prophecy later on. And also that the nations descended from Abraham would possess the gates of their enemies, key choke points in the geography of the earth. It also included a promise that Abraham's birthright descendants would bear the name of Isaac upon them. That we find in Genesis 21:12, which is a very important clue for locating Abraham's birthright descendants throughout history. It says, "In Isaac will your seed be called or be named." So we should expect that name of Isaac to follow the birthright descendants. This is affirmed twice in the New Testament. I won't dwell time on it, but on the screen you should see Hebrews 11:18 and Romans 9, verses 7 to 8. The writers of those books affirmed that that was a covenant that God was still going to be implementing in New Testament times. Now, the covenant between God and Abraham was passed down to Isaac, then to Jacob, who was renamed Israel, and in Genesis 48 to the sons of Joseph. That's Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, let's examine both scriptural and secular evidence to confirm that Hosea's prophecy came to pass after the tribe's exile from the land. In Jeremiah 3 is a chapter which was written about a century after Samaria fell. So this is when the 10 tribes are gone. Judah, at least a remnant of it, is still there around Jerusalem. But Yahweh sent Jeremiah with a message to both Israel and to Judah at that time, showing that Yahweh had clearly not forsaken Israel because he was giving Jeremiah a message to send to them, even after their removal from the Promised Land. Now in verses 11 to 12 of Jeremiah 3, it says, this is quoting God, saying, "Backsliding Israel has justified herself more than treacherous Judah. Go and proclaim these words toward the north, and say, return, backsliding Israel. I am merciful, and I will not keep my anger forever." Now, I'm coming back to this, so if you want, keep your finger there if you're going through the Bible. But look at Jeremiah 51:5, which was written perhaps 125 years after Samaria fell. There, Yahweh flatly declares, Israel has not been forsaken. That's referring to the 10 tribes of Israel. It says, Israel has not been forsaken, nor Judah, of the Lord of hosts. So those saying that God forsook the 10 tribes when he expelled them from the Holy Lands have totally overlooked this verse. Over a century after their expulsion from the Holy Land, Yahweh is categorically declaring he has not forsaken the 10 tribes. He couldn't forsake them. The covenant he made with Abraham was eternally binding, and it was unconditional. And that was what was referred to in Hosea 1:10, where God was telling them, I'm still going to be keeping that covenant of Abraham with you, even in exile. So the covenant with Abraham was in effect long before the covenant with Moses was ever made. So the covenant with Abraham was not affected by what happened under the terms of the covenant with Moses. Now, Yahweh still had promised to keep about Abraham's descendants, and he always keeps his promises. Those who say that he forsook the Israelites are actually asserting that Yahweh reneged on his covenant with Abraham, which he couldn't possibly do. Back in Jeremiah 3, verse 14, Yahweh says to Israel and Judah, I am married to you. So Yahweh refers to his relationship with Israel and Judah as a covenant relationship, which it was. Now, there's more in Jeremiah yet, in this chapter 3. If all Israelites had gone into captivity in Assyria, that's to the east of the old promised land in Mesopotamia, Yahweh would have said in Jeremiah 3:12, proclaim this message toward the east, Jeremiah. But the Creator knew that the main body of Israelites were not in Assyria. He knew they were north of Jerusalem, and he said, proclaim this message to the north. And this is one of the factors of ancient history that people have overlooked in following the 10 tribes. If you draw a line north of Jerusalem, and you come to the Black Sea region of the people that were called the Scythians. You'll see that straight north up by the Black Sea, and we'll be talking a great deal about them later. But now Daniel 7 also confirms that Daniel knew that by his lifetime the 10 tribes had been widely scattered, many locations throughout the world. Is in his prayer in Daniel 9, where he's confessing the sins of his people, both of Israel and Judah, he says in verse 7, he refers to all Israel that are near and that are far off, through all the countries, plural, where you have driven them. So Daniel knew that the 10 tribes had been driven into many different countries by the time of his life, and that some of them still live very near Daniel. Those are the ones that would have been taken captive by Assyria to the cities of the Medes by the Assyrians, but later on the Persian Empire replaced them, of course. But Daniel was still living in the cities of the Medes of the Medo-Persian Empire at that time. But the Israelites that were afar off in other locations were the ones that didn't go into an Assyrian captivity, which we'll talk more about later. They kept control of their destiny, even though they were exiled. But in both Jeremiah and Daniel's time, the whereabouts of the 10 tribes was still known to the prophets and people of God. Genesis 49 includes specific prophecies about each one of the tribes in the latter days, which I believe is our time that we're living in right now. But it clearly shows that whatever you think the latter days are, all of the tribes of Israel are going to be alive and on the earth during that time, because the book of Genesis gives us clues for locating them. And my books follow those clues. Now, Ezekiel 37 also has a prophecy regarding the 2 sticks, about the 2 houses of Israel and Judah, which will remain separate throughout history and not be reunited until the Messianic age begins. Revelation 7 includes a prophecy about a mysterious group called the 144,000. But these are all Israelites from each of the tribes of Israel on earth at the end of the age. So the Bible in several places prophesies that the 10 tribes of Israel absolutely must be found among the nations in the latter days. If they died out, the Bible has failed, and we're wasting our time. But as my books point out, you can trace them very easily and see that God has kept his promises about them throughout history and today. Now let's look at some secular sources that also give information on where the Israelites went after their empire fell under David Solomon. Josephus, the famous Jewish writer of the 1st century A.D., had, I believe, Hosea 1 in mind when he wrote regarding the 10 tribes of Israel, and that should be up on the screen giving the appropriate part of his book where he writes this. Josephus wrote, "There are but 2 tribes in Asia and Europe subject to the Romans, while the 10 tribes are beyond Euphrates till now, and are an immense multitude, not to be estimated by numbers." So that shows that the prophecy of Hosea 1:10 had already been fulfilled and was being fulfilled by the time of Josephus' lifetime, but they were too big to count. Josephus confirmed the blessing of great population increases that were part of that Abrahamic covenant. So as of the 1st century A.D., when our Savior lived, the 10 tribes of Israel were not lost. Educated Jews such as Josephus knew exactly who they were and where they were. Also in Matthew 10, verses 5 to 6, Yeshua himself said he was sending the apostles to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. That's the 10 tribes. Yeshua's assignment didn't seem to surprise any of them at all. They knew the addresses to which they were being sent. It was common knowledge at that time. Now, one reason people can't find the 10 tribes of Israel in history is they incorrectly use a minimalist approach, assuming that all they're going to find are scattered little remnants. Well, that's quite wrong. Hosea 1 tells us that we must use a maximalist approach for finding the 10 tribes. We have to look for them among the large nations of the earth who will be enjoying the specific Abrahamic covenant blessings. There was a man called Ortelius who was a 16th century geographer in Europe. He wrote that the Israelites of the 10 tribes migrated to the Caucasus mountain region and that they took the name Gothi. Later on, that was spelled by the Romans as Goths, who later on became known as Visigoths and Ostrogoths, but these people had an Israelite origin. Eldad, who was a medieval Jewish writer, wrote, "Many of the Israelites did not go into captivity." Now that's referring to the Assyrian captivity. but it says they evaded the calamity, going off with their flocks, and that the chief or prince whom they appointed could muster 120,000 horsemen and 100,000 foot soldiers. So with 220,000 armed men escorting this band of Israelites that was migrating out of the old Promised Land and heading north to the Caucasus Mountains, the entire band had to number 2 or 3 million when you include all the numbers of wives, children, the elderly, etc. So the concept that the 10 tribes of Israel were lost is a fairly recent concept. Even in medieval times, people knew the Israelites had fled north to the Caucasus Mountains to evade the Assyrian captivity. Now, under King David and Solomon, Israel was a world power in the ancient times. This has been lost track of because King David and Solomon's history is so old to our perspective. They were ancient history at the time the Roman Empire was on earth. Remember that Kings David and Solomon were allied to the Phoenicians of Tyre and Sidon. The Bible records that they practically merged their societies with the alliance under King Hiram, and they merged their navy fleets into one entity. Now, secular history tells us that the Phoenician Empire was the dominant empire on earth from around 1000 to approximately 700 BC. Now, that happens to also be the exact period of time from Kings David and Solomon, around 1000 BC, to just after the Israelites fled that region. So the real power of the Phoenician Empire was the Israelites at that particular time. The small city-states of Tyre and Sidon reverted to a much smaller status in the world after the Israelites left. Now, there's much evidence in my books that the Israelites were present in ancient North America. They had a 20-acre temple site to Baal and other pagan deities in New England. This is, maybe some of you have seen the program called America's Stonehenge on cable TV, which just shows the foundations of the buildings that's all that's left now. Because the colonists, when they came to the New World from Europe, dismantled them because they needed those stoneworks to build their own structures. A trilingual artifact, much like the Rosetta Stone, dating to about 800 to 600 BC, was found near Davenport, Iowa, up in my area of the Midwest. It had ancient Egyptian and Semitic inscriptions on it, showing parallel accounts in different languages. The Israelites were also present in South America, as the Phoenicians were known to be extremely good mariners and sailed all over the world, far more than we give them credit for now. One nation in South America was known as the Island of Iron by the Hebrews and the Phoenicians. Now, for those of you who know Hebrew, the Hebrew word for iron is barzel. We don't have the vowels, but the consonants were B-R-Z-L. Can you think of a nation in South America today that has those consonants? Well, that's Brazil. And Brazil is still an iron ore exporting region. And Brazil, although people do not realize it, is still known by the Hebrew name given to it during the times of David and Solomon, when it was named after iron. Now, Yahweh's followers were here in North America, too. An Ohio River mound builder grave was dug up in 1860, the year the Civil War began, and it had an artifact with the 10 Commandments in ancient Hebrew found in it. Photos of the original artifact and other artifacts found with it are in my books, as I had permission from the museum to reproduce the photographs in it. So it's in that book I'm talking about today. The 10 Commandments were also written in ancient Hebrew on a large slab in the New Mexico desert along a dry riverbed that once flowed into the Rio Grande. I've been there, inspected it, and a wide variety of photos of this incredible artifact and other Hebrew inscriptions in that region are in my new books. Now, this artifact has the ancient Paleo-Hebrew script, which would have prevailed about the time of David and Solomon, not the post-captivity script. My book cites evidence that it dates to the time of King Solomon, and there's an extensive photo gallery of this artifact at my website, which is www.stephenmcollins.com, Stephen spelled with a V. But there's also an explanation of the 10 Commandments inscription and the other Hebrew inscriptions that have been found in that region at my website. Now, the term Phoenicia was a Greek term given to the allied nations living between Turkey and Egypt along the East Mediterranean. That included Israel, Tyre, Sidon, and then later Judah would have lived there too. The Bible tells us King David's army reached the Euphrates River, which made him a neighbor of Assyria. Did you realize the Bible and secular history recorded tremendous secret that King David conquered the Assyrian Empire. 1 Chronicles 19 describes a great war where the Israelite army was faced by an alliance of many nations, it calls them the Syrians and the Mesopotamian kings, who came to destroy Israel. It even talks about the Mesopotamian kings being so certain of victory, they set up their seats to watch the battle. The Mesopotamians were the Assyrians. Assyria ruled Mesopotamia, and all the other Mesopotamian kings would have been their vassals. Well, the Israelites won this war, but keep in mind David's forces were already at the Euphrates River. So as they were pursuing the fleeing Assyrians, invading Assyria was just one step across the river. Secular histories record that Assyria was invaded, defeated, and occupied by an invading Semitic army from the west during the reign of King David. I have the secular sources quoted in my book. Those Semites had to be the Israelites. David wrote of this war in Psalm 83, where he mentions a great alliance, including Assyria, which he calls Asher, which fought Israel and helped the children of Lot. Now, that 1 Chronicles 19 war began with a rebellion against Israel by the Ammonites, the children of Lot, who hired Asher and the Mesopotamians in Syria. But I can't linger there. You can get the story about this in the book. The prophet Nathan gave David a message from Yahweh wherein he stated to David, I have made you a great name, like unto the great men that are in the earth. David was one of the dominant kings of the ancient world, not a minor monarch of a shepherd kingdom. He belongs up there with Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and other conquerors. And during the Messianic age, his true history and the size of his empire will be revealed to all. Now, one part of the answer where all the Israelites went during the exile becomes easy when we realize the kingdom of Israel was the home kingdom of the Phoenician Empire. Israel, then, as which we call the Phoenicians, had many colonies in Europe, Africa, the British Isles, even in North America. My book includes much information from the books of the late Dr. Barry Fell, a Harvard professor, who wrote 3 books documenting that the Hebrews, Carthaginians, Egyptians, Romans, and even Islamic Arabs were here in North America. The late Dr. Cyrus Gordon, one of the most famous archaeologists ever, wrote a book called Before Columbus, in which he strongly states that the evidence that the Israelites and other ancient cultures were present in North America is overwhelming. He declared one popular artifact called the Bat Creek Stone to be a valid example of an ancient Hebrew inscription in the American Southeast. He notes the Smithsonian Institute first rejected it as Hebrew because they were trying to read it upside down. Hebrew language coins have also been found in the Ozarks region of the United States. This evidence is described in detail in my books. Now, one very interesting piece of evidence is that the ancient copper mines by Lake Michigan were worked to exhaustion around 1000 BC. And as Dr. Fell's book points out, there's no evidence where it went. It used in our continent. Now, the Bible gives us the answer, I believe, where it says King David was told, as you remember, that he could not build the temple, but he was allowed to amass all the materials for the temple that Solomon would build. And it says King David amassed copper beyond counting it around 1000 BC for the temple of God, the exact time the copper mines of Lake Michigan were mined to exhaustion. So this copper had to come from outside Israel, as there wasn't enough copper to be mined in the Promised Land. My book offers the evidence that the Phoenician Israelite Empire constructed special vessels to transport massive quantities of raw ores and materials over the ocean. Dr. Fell even writes of a Phoenician inscription that was dug up off the coast of Maine, saying, "Ships of Phoenicia, cargo platform." That was the inscription, as evidence that Phoenician ships had regularly scheduled trips across the Atlantic. Now, secular history records that Assyria was very weak for a century during the reign of King David and Solomon, and shortly thereafter, until a great biblical event occurred which allowed Assyria to recover its strength. 2 Chronicles 13:17 tells us about a horrible civil war between Israel and Judah, in which 500,000 Israelite soldiers died. We don't even know how many casualties Judah had, but 500,000 Israelite men died in that war. This weakened Israel terribly, and they had to pull back their garrison troops from all over their empire It had to shrink back toward the promised land, and this allowed Assyria to recover in a vacuum. This also explains why Assyria angrily kept invading Israel until it fell. Assyria was actually seeking revenge for Israel's early defeat and occupation of Assyria. The Israelites controlled Gibraltar for many centuries, one of the gates of the enemies. Now, Spain was an Israelite colony that called Iberia. The consonants there are the consonants of the word Eber, who was the namesake of the Hebrews or Hebrews. The British Isles had Israelite colonies and have had the name Britain on them for 3,000 years, Brit being, of course, the Hebrew word for covenant. So even today in our modern world, the British Isles have the name covenant stamped on them in Hebrew. This information is necessary so you can see that the birthright descendants of Abraham were already world powers by the time of David, so that when they scattered across the face of the earth, it's not illogical at all to see that these numerous people set up new empires of their own. A couple of the clues we'll keep in mind in tracing the 10 tribes is Phoenicia's empire had that name BRT, which they put on Britain, for the covenant. They knew they were the covenant people, and they called themselves that in place names and on their coins. The second clue is Assyrian records tell us the Israelites were called the Bet Sak, or the house of Isaac, known to other people. Amos 7:16 confirms this. In there it refers to the house of Israel, meaning the 10 tribes, as being the house of Isaac. So it's important to note that even before they scattered from the promised land, they were being known by the name of Isaac, which Genesis 21:12 had prophesied. So where did they all go? Well, the Assyrians only claimed about a paltry 27,000 captives when Samaria fell. 2 Kings 17, verses 5 to 6 and 25, shows that the land of Israel had been abandoned by its people. It had reverted to the wild. It talks about lions overrunning the land, and there has to be an awful lot of prey animals for lions to overrun the land, which means there aren't any people there hunting it. It says the king of Assyria went up and down the land of Israel, and there's no word that he found anybody anywhere other than the ones who stayed in Samaria. The people who stayed in Samaria either were the diehards that wouldn't quit and stayed with the last king of Israel who died there, or they were like heroic ones who did an Alamo battle and pinned down the Assyrian Empire in its rear while the rest of them migrated northward. We don't know the truth on which it was. But the Israelites numbered about 3 million when they left Egypt out of the Exodus. They certainly had increased their numbers when they entered their promised land. The Bible, in one census, tells us David had over 1 million able-bodied men in his army, and of course he wasn't even allowed to include the Levites in the total. So there's a lot of Israelites unaccounted for in the Bible's listing of the tribes that went into captivity. 2 Kings 15:29 indicates that many Israelites went into captivity about 20 years before Samaria fell. These were the tribes of Gilead, which was Reuben, Gad, and a half of the tribe of Manasseh, as well as Naphtali. Those tribes were about a third or so of the Israelites. Then the people of Samaria were only about 27,000 survivors, so that was just a small rear guard. This leaves about two-thirds of the tribes of Israel unaccounted for. The Bible simply doesn't say specifically where they went, but it doesn't say they went into an Assyrian captivity, although we do know they all went into exile. Now remember, Daniel said that the 10 tribes were very widely scattered among the countries in his lifetime. Well, one part of the answer is easy when we remember that the kingdom of Israel in the Phoenician period was a maritime empire with huge fleets sailing the seas, and Israel had colonies in several continents. It is known the Phoenicians were able to navigate by the stars, but what about during cloudy and stormy weather? I mean, you have to know where you're going if you have a schedule to keep. My books cite a 1910 book which revealed the answer, that the Phoenicians had an ingenious invention called a water compass. They would place magnetic lodestones in a basin of water and mark them so that they could always know magnetic north. In other words, they had compasses in there in a gyroscopically centered way as best as they could do it in a basin of water to always know where magnetic north was. So they could keep a schedule and sail even in cloudy, stormy weather. Now back to those Israelites just before the last Assyrian invasion. Put yourself in their position. About a third of the nation has already been taken captive. The prophets are telling you it's over. that the Assyrians are coming and your nation is going to fall. And the handwriting's on the wall. You either have the choice of staying, going into captivity and becoming a slave with your family for generations, or you could board one of the many, many vessels in the Phoenician Israelite fleet and take your possessions with you and sail to Africa, Europe, or the British Isles and keep your freedom. Which do you think you would do? I'd opt for freedom. Well, many Israelites had the ability to flee by sea to escape the Assyrians, and they did for decades. Spanish archaeological records confirm that many wealthy Israelites came to Spain with their wealth before Assyria defeated Israel. Ancient British and Irish records record large numbers of the tribe of Simeon, and Dan, it names them by name, as arriving in Ireland and Wales about the time Samaria fell. In fact, so many Israelites wanted out, they had to establish an entirely new colony in North Africa. The Israelites called it Kiryat Hadashah. In Hebrew, this was New City. It grew wealthy, and it had inherited all of the Phoenician trade routes in the Atlantic. It possessed immense fleets of its own, and it almost destroyed Rome under its famous general called Hannibal. This is the Hannibal who marched those elephants across the Alps into Italy. Hannibal is really an Israelite name. It's a combination of the word Hananiah and Baal, as the Carthaginians worshiped Baal, the same false god that the Israelites went into idolatry in. Now, we don't know this city as Kiryat Hadashah, its original name, because it was destroyed by the Romans later. And we know it by its Roman name, which is Carthage. So we call them the Carthaginians instead of the Kiriathinians. So we know it by its Roman name as an accident of history. But Carthage's language and culture was Hebrew, although they developed later their own script. Its leaders were called the Shofetim, or judges. Its priests were called the Kohanim, or in other words, priests in Hebrew. Now there's a very strange episode in history. Hannibal was a phenomenally excellent general, and his Carthaginian army had defeated one Roman army after another in Italy. The last Roman army defending Rome had been defeated, and all Hannibal had to do to destroy Rome and take over the Roman Empire and make it part of the Carthaginian Empire was to march in and take the city. There was no one to defend it. But he just dithered and wouldn't give the order to go in and occupy the city. Well, during his dithering, another Roman army marched in to offer defense to the city, and it eventually did not fall. And historians have been absolutely mystified, wondering why Hannibal didn't just act in his own interest and take the city. I think Yahweh gave Hannibal a spirit of inaction at that time. And it was God himself who saved Rome from being conquered by an Israelite-led army of Carthaginians. Well, why would he do that? Well, remember, our Creator will always keep his prophecies and his promises. Daniel 2 records a prophecy given in the form of a dream to Nebuchadnezzar about a succession of Gentile world empires. That vision doesn't talk about all the world empires. It's a succession of Gentile world empires. The final one was to be the Roman Empire and its revival through history. You know, the Roman Empire was the iron, which is divided into two legs, just as the Roman Empire was divided into a Western and an Eastern Roman Empire. If Hannibal had taken Rome, Carthage would have ruled the Mediterranean world, and there never would have been a Roman Empire, which means Yahweh's prophecy about Rome would have failed. So God himself intervened to save Rome from an Israelite army so that Rome could grow into the empire that it was prophesied to be in Daniel 2. This is just one example of the fascinating facts about history when you look at it through the Israelite lens that you'll do when you read my books. My books do cover the entire fascinating history of Carthage, including their naval skills, their wars with Rome, their close trade relations with the Mayans in our hemisphere. After all, where do you think those Mayans learned about pyramids and human sacrifice? Well, the Carthaginians lived in North Africa. They knew about the pyramids. The human sacrifice, grisly rites were part of Baal worship, which was in Carthage, and they brought it over to the Mayans. Carthage also invented a threshing machine, which had geared wheels. The Romans preserved this information. So if you can visualize the Carthaginian engineers making even harvesting machines with geared wheels and mechanisms, this perhaps gives an insight into the knowledge which Carthage inherited from the kingdom of Israel under Solomon. Now, you may have heard of the Antikythera mechanism. There's been a number of cable TV documentaries on this. It's a very advanced geared calculating machine found off the coast of Greece. It was brought up from a shipwreck. The assumptions in those documentaries is that it was built in the Greek sphere of a region up in the area of Greece and Macedonia because it was found there. However, Greece also traded with Carthage. They were enemies for much of the time, but they had trade back and forth. Since Carthage was known to work with geared machines, maybe that Antikythera mechanism that was brought up from the bottom of the ocean by Greece was invented not by the Greeks, but within the Carthaginian Empire, and it was being brought to Greece as trade goods or as something stolen when the vessel carrying it sank. Now, Carthage, like Phoenicia, controlled Gibraltar, which was one of the gates of their enemies, a promise given to the Israelite descendants of Abraham. That promise was inherited by Carthage. They kept Greece and Rome out of the Atlantic Ocean for many centuries because for centuries, Carthage dominated Greece and Rome. Yet it was Carthaginian state policy to not allow any other nation to follow its ships to its secret colonies out in the Atlantic. However, the Greeks knew that Carthage had a monopoly on an extremely rich land somewhere out there in the Atlantic. After all, sailors will have loose lips in port, and so the Greeks learned from Carthaginian sailors, no doubt, some of the details. Well, one of the historians you probably learned about in history was Aristotle, the famous Greek historian or writer. He wrote, in the sea outside the Pillars of Hercules, which means the Gibraltar region, so he's talking about out in the Atlantic, he says an island was found by the Carthaginians, the masters of the Western Ocean, a wilderness having navigable rivers, which was many days sailing distance away from those Pillars of Hercules. Now, another Greek writer named Diodorus, I'm not sure the pronunciation of it, wrote there is a very great island in the vast ocean. Many days sail from Libya westward, Libya meaning a term for North Africa. The soil is very fruitful. A great part is mountainous, but much is a plain, watered with several navigable rivers. This is the secret colony that the Carthaginians had. Well, these are obviously describing North America. North America has a very mountainous region, but much of it is a central plain, watered with navigable rivers, the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Ohio, and all the rest of them that empty into the Mississippi. So here in the ancient Greek records, we have a very good description of North America as being a Carthaginian colony. Now, Carthaginian coins and inscriptions have been found in Colorado, New York, Georgia, Alabama, Connecticut, Nevada, and other places. It's clear the secret Atlantic colony that gave Carthage its wealth was North America. Well, why isn't that in your history books? That's a good question, and I think the reason is that there is a God of this world who is the father of lies and does not want the truth about the 10 tribes of Israel known to the modern world. He wants their identity kept hidden and secret, not only from them, but all